single mom played a piano melody. The billionaire froze, hearing the song he wrote never released in a grand time-worn room of the Magnolia House, nestled deep in the heart of Savannah, Georgia. The sound of a piano rose unexpectedly on a quiet autumn afternoon. The one playing was a woman, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her hands still dusted with remnants from the day's cleaning. She had no idea that tucked away in the shadows of the second floor, a man stood motionless, his entire being stilled by the warm scent of aged wood and the fading sunlight filtering through the windows. Ethan Whitaker, the man who owned the entire estate, a reclusive billionaire returning to Savannah after more than 9 years away, had just stepped into the house when he heard that melody. A melody he had never shared, never published, never even fully written down. It was a song he had composed one distant summer as a young man of 20, a heart still raw with longing and loss. A nameless love song buried beneath the years, thought to be forgotten. But today, here in this room, it played again, not a single note out of place, carried by the voice of a woman he had never met. Her voice was not overly trained, nor did it reach high dramatic pitches, but it held something he believed he would never find again. Pure emotion, gentle sorrow, warmth, like a whisper from the past, returning to him. That woman was Claire Morgan, 28 years old, a single mother working part-time at the city library and taking cleaning jobs at Magnolia House to care for her 8-year-old daughter. She had no idea that the man who held the lease to the entire estate was the very one who had written the song she often hummed to her child on rainy nights. A melody she had once heard at a concert when she was just a girl, never forgotten, though its name and its composer had slipped beyond her reach. Ethan watched from the upstairs railing, unable to tear his eyes away from the image of her hands gently moving across the worn keys as if in conversation with herself. What left him speechless was not just the music, but the way she played it, as though she were telling his story, as though she had once sat beside him on the night he first wrote those opening lines. But that was impossible. That melody had never left his soul, never been touched by anyone except one person. A girl named Charlotte, the woman he had once loved with all the recklessness of youth, and the one he lost when fear and inexperience had driven him away. 9 years passed. Ethan became a symbol of power in the world of high finance, a billionaire praised for his sharp vision and strategic mind. But behind every building he raised, every deal he closed, there remained an emptiness he could not outrun. Music, love, unfinished dreams, and a song without a name that had been left behind, until today. Claire stopped planning when she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned surprised to see a stranger standing there. He wore a simple white shirt, his eyes dark and piercing, yet the look he gave her was quietly gentle. No words were spoken. Only the last golden light of the day touched the old brick wall, catching the slow drift of dust in the air. Claire rose slightly uneasy, but Ethan gave a faint nod, a silent thank you. In that moment, neither of them knew everything had begun to change. That forgotten melody would become the key to a hidden past, to mistakes left unresolved, and to a chance to rewrite everything. Not just for Ethan, not just for Claire, but for a child who had never known the sound of a father's voice. And so, in that empty room, the music played on a song still without a name, yet filled with the quiet power of an unspoken promise. A promise waiting to be fulfilled. If you've been listening and feel a quiet stirring in your heart, then perhaps this story was meant for you. Sometimes melodies thought to be long-forgotten memories buried deep within us can be awakened again by a single fleeting moment in life. If you find comfort in gentle, reflective moments and are drawn to real-life stories rich with emotion, then we invite you to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel right now. And please don't forget to like and share this video with someone you care about. You never know, a song, a memory, or a whisper within this story may reach someone you never expected. Where are you listening from today? Leave a comment below and let us know the place you're hearing this from, so we can see just how far heartfelt stories like this can travel. Thank you for staying with us. Now we invite you to continue on to the next part of the story. The next day, Claire returned to Magnolia House with a heart caught somewhere between unease and curiosity. She couldn't stop thinking about the man from the day before. There was something about him that left her unsettled, though she couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't just the way he had stood silently at the doorway of the music room, nor the quiet mystery that seemed to cloak his every movement. It was the feeling strange and unshakable that they had met before somewhere far away, somewhere long ago. Claire was not someone prone to daydreams. Life as a single mother did not allow her much space to drift away from reality. But there had been something in the way he looked at her that stirred her in ways she had long forgotten. As she stepped into the main hall to begin her afternoon cleaning the house, manager approached and informed her that the new owner wanted to see her. He had a few requests regarding the piano in the lounge she had cleaned yesterday. Claire nodded, steadying herself. She already suspected it was the man from the previous day. When the office door opened, she entered and saw him standing with his back to the room, gazing out the window at the garden, scattered with fallen leaves. There was no assistant, no cluttered desk like in most offices, only a piano resting in the corner and a steaming cup of tea placed on a sturdy oak table. Claire stood quietly waiting for him to speak. It took several seconds before he turned, and once again his eyes caught her off guard. They held a strange coldness, and yet a sorrow so deep it felt as though they had witnessed things too heavy to ever be spoken aloud. Ethan stepped closer and gestured for her to sit. He introduced himself simply, then went straight to the point. He said he had heard her playing the piano the day before. His voice was low, calm, but carried something unreadable beneath its surface. Claire hesitated, then apologized if she had disturbed anyone. She explained that her hand had brushed against the keys while cleaning, and since the piano still worked, she had sung a melody she often used to lull her daughter to sleep. Ethan shook his head. No, she hadn't disturbed him. On the contrary, it was the first time in a very long while he had heard that melody outside the confines of his own memory. Claire looked up at him, a flicker of doubt rising inside her, but Ethan had already turned away, his voice softer now. He asked simply where had she heard the song. Claire answered honestly. She couldn't quite remember. She had once heard someone play it during a small concert when she was a young girl. No one knew the name of the song, but it had remained with her like a silent lullaby etched into her mind. Over the years, she had sung it often, each time adding little parts of the melody, completing it in her own way. Ethan looked at her as if trying to speak, but said nothing. After a moment, he nodded and thanked her for bringing back a cherished memory. The conversation ended quickly. Claire rose and left the room. Her thoughts tangled. Who was this man really? And why had his eyes, when she spoke, looked as if they were caught between hope and fear? A few hours later, Claire picked up her daughter from school. Lily ran to her, her dark brown hair dancing in the breeze, holding a postcard she had drawn of the old house where her mother worked. Claire laughed, took her hand, and together they returned to Magnolia House for an afternoon cleaning shift. As they stepped into the music room, Lily was immediately drawn to the piano. She moved toward it, placing her hands on the keys as if they were calling her name. Claire was about to stop her when the door opened. Ethan entered. Claire startled and began to apologize, but he raised a hand. "It's all right," he said. "The little girl seems to like the piano." Lily looked up at him, wide-eyed and fearless. "Are you the owner of this house?" she asked. Ethan nodded with a smile. "Would you like to learn a few notes?" Claire opened her mouth to politely decline, but Lily was already nodding enthusiastically. And so, in a room bathed in the gentle light of the setting sun, Lily sat at the piano bench, Ethan beside her, gently placing her hands where they needed to be. The first notes floated into the air. Claire stood in the corner of the room, clutching the strap of her bag. In that moment, she didn't know whether to feel joy or concern, because something had just begun, something she could not yet name, but her heart knew with startling clarity that for the first time in many years, someone had touched the part of her memory she had tried so hard to leave behind. And that someone was the man whose name she had only just learned today, Ethan Whitaker. That afternoon, after her cleaning shift had ended, Claire found herself unable to shake the image of her daughter sitting beside the old piano, eyes wide with concentration, as the stranger gently guided each small hand across the keys. The room, once silent during all her working days, seemed suddenly awake. The first notes Lily played were hesitant, but they carried a kind of joy Claire hadn't seen in her daughter's eyes in a very long time. Ethan didn't speak much, communicating instead with quiet gestures and a calm, patient gaze. Lily listened intently, so focused she hardly blinked. Claire stood quietly in the corner of the room, one hand resting over her heart where her pulse seemed to slow and echo like something ancient being stirred. She couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was because the moment felt so unfamiliar, so intimate, so beautiful, and yet so dangerously close. She had never allowed a stranger near Lily in this way before. After years of being a mother on her own, she had learned how to protect her child above all else. But today, she didn't feel fear. Only a strange trembling in her heart, like strings being softly plucked back to life. Ethan turned toward her, his eyes gentle as autumn wind. Claire stepped forward, sat beside Lily, and gently placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Just enough to remind her she was there, not enough to interrupt. Ethan watched them for a moment, then spoke. Your daughter has a gift. The way she listens, the way she feels, the rhythm that's not something you can teach easily. Claire nodded, her eyes still on Lily. She's loved music since she was little. I can't afford formal lessons, but she listens when I sing. Sometimes she taps out rhythms on the table, and sometimes she makes up little tunes of her own. Ethan tilted his head slightly as though capturing an image he didn't want to forget. Would you want Lily to learn piano? Claire turned toward him, uncertain. He must have sensed the caution in her eyes because he continued gently. I'm not suggesting anything beyond your comfort. I used to be a musician, and if you're open to it, I'd be happy to give her a few basic lessons. No fee, just because it would be a shame to let a gift like that go untouched. Claire said nothing at first. Everything he said made sense. His voice held nothing that triggered her instincts to pull away, and yet the hesitation lingered. Ethan seemed to read her silence. I understand. You don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me, but you're welcome to stay in the room any time. I would never be alone with her. I only want to help. Claire looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. It was an agreement, not fully, but it was the first crack in the wall she had built. She turned to Lily, placed her hand over her daughter's tiny fingers. Do you really want to learn? Lily beamed, her eyes bright with something like wonder. Yes, I do. I love the sound. It feels like magic. Ethan smiled. Claire gave a quiet laugh, then turned back to him. If you're truly offering, we'll be here every Wednesday afternoon. That's when I work this shift, but I'll always stay in the room. Ethan nodded. That's entirely up to you. There's no rush. But if she's ready, so am I. Claire took Lily's hand and led her from the room. But as they passed through the doorway, she glanced back. Ethan was still standing there, one hand resting gently on the piano, as if listening for the last echo of a melody still unfinished. And Claire understood then. Something had changed, not just in her daughter, not just in that old music room, but within herself. She didn't know where the road ahead might lead them. But today, for the first time in years, she felt a door open, quietly, without fanfare. Simply a small hand pressing a single key on a long-forgotten piano, and that she knew was enough to begin a new chapter. That Wednesday afternoon, with the late sunlight still clinging to the leaves outside the tall windows of the music room, Claire and Lily returned to Magnolia House just as they had promised. Lily ran ahead, her excitement carrying her straight to the old piano, while Claire followed more slowly, her eyes still carrying the quiet caution of a mother who had spent years learning how to guard her child's world alone. Ethan was already there. He stood beside the piano, arranging a few sheets of music and brushing dust from the ivory keys, now softened with time. When he saw them enter, he smiled. Hello, Lily. Are you ready? Lily nodded eagerly, her wavy hair catching the light as it lifted with her movement. Claire settled into a wooden chair in the corner of the room, close enough to hear every word, far enough to allow space. Ethan began the lesson by reviewing what Lily had learned the week before. Her small hands found their place on the keys, trying to recall the positions and rhythms he had shown her. His guidance was gentle, never forceful, letting the lesson feel like a game, a small discovery. Claire watched silently, her heart slowly softening as she saw the light return to her daughter's eyes each time she played a phrase correctly. After nearly half an hour, Ethan shifted to something different. He reached into the drawer beneath the piano and took out a piece of yellowed sheet music folded neatly with no title. He placed it in front of Lily, then turned to Claire. I found this in an old collection while going through the storage room. No one seems to know where it came from. There's no name. But when I played it, it felt familiar. Claire stepped closer and took the sheet in her hands. The notes had been written by hand, the ink faint and slightly smudged with age, but the structure remained clear. She stared at it for a long time, as if something within the page had quietly reached out to her. The melody. It didn't feel foreign. Somehow sounds began forming in her mind, notes she hadn't read but seemed to hear. She couldn't explain it, but she knew this song. She had heard it before, or perhaps she had once sung it. Ethan noticed her silence and spoke gently. "If you'd like to try, the piano is here." Claire looked up, surprised, and for reasons she couldn't name, she nodded. She sat beside the instrument, and Ethan stood close by, his eyes quietly following her every movement. Her fingers touched the keys, and she began to play slowly, searching like someone walking an old path for the first time in years. The melody emerged, not perfect, not complete, but unmistakably alive. It began with a delicate introduction, then opened into a warmer, deeper current full of quiet sorrow and unspoken memory. Ethan closed his eyes. He listened to every note, and in that moment something inside him fractured. Claire didn't know, but she was playing the song he had written during a long-ago summer. A nameless piece he had never finished, a love song born from a hidden longing and the kind of loneliness no one had ever seen. Claire stopped midway and looked up at him. "I don't understand. I don't know how I know this." Ethan stared at her for a long time, then slowly shook his head. "Some music doesn't have to be learned. It stays with us like a memory we haven't named yet." Claire fell silent. Inside her, it felt like a wave had just passed through. She couldn't explain it, but she knew the notes she had played were not just sound. They were a sign. Something long asleep had stirred, and now it was beginning to wake. In that old room, as the evening sun faded, forgotten melodies began to speak once more. And in the hearts of two people who believed they were strangers, something old yet achingly familiar was quietly finding its way back home. Ever since that quiet afternoon when Claire sat at the piano and played the nameless melody in the music room of Magnolia House, something had quietly shifted. There were no declarations, no agreements made, but from that day forward, Ethan began to appear more often. And each time Claire arrived with Lily for her cleaning shift, he was already there. It never felt like coincidence. It felt like someone waiting patiently, deliberately. Claire noticed this quickly. She was not naive. She recognized the intention behind the rhythm of these encounters. But what unsettled her most was not his presence. It was the strange peace she felt because of it. Ethan never imposed himself. He didn't cross boundaries, didn't barge into the small world she had so carefully built around her and Lily. He was simply there. Sometimes it was a cup of tea, placed quietly on the wooden table in the hallway, always the kind she preferred. Sometimes it was a set of music sheets carefully laminated so Lily could practice without tearing the fragile pages. There were afternoons when he said almost nothing at all, simply listening, as Lily played, applauding softly when she finished a piece. Claire began to ask herself questions about him, about what he wasn't saying, about the song she had stumbled upon that afternoon, the one that now felt more familiar each time she played it. She used to believe memory couldn't be invented, but now she began to doubt even that, because this melody wasn't just sound, it stirred something deep within her, a foggy knowing like she had once belonged to it and had simply forgotten why. Ethan remained quiet, reserved, but never cold. Whenever they spoke, he kept a distance that felt intentional, respectful. But in brief moments, in the flicker of his gaze, Claire saw something she recognized. A person who had lost enough to be afraid of letting anyone come too close. One afternoon, as Lily ran off to fetch a book from the small library in the house, Claire and Ethan sat together in the music room, the warm light of evening pouring through the window panes. He asked her about the songs she used to sing to her daughter. Claire smiled softly and said there were rainy nights when she had nothing but her voice to comfort Lily to sleep. She sang whatever came to mind. Sometimes old lullabies, sometimes melodies she made up on the spot. Ethan listened, then said something that stilled her. "Those songs," he said, "sometimes come from the deepest part of us, songs that don't need a reason to exist. They only need to be sung so that someone somewhere doesn't feel alone." Claire looked at him for a long moment after that, and she understood. He wasn't only speaking of her. He was speaking of himself too. Their meetings continued whether they had reason or not. Ethan began teaching Lily small techniques to strengthen her fingers. Claire in turn started bringing simple homemade snacks, sometimes offering a portion to him without saying much. They remained polite, still called each other by full names, still kept the kind of distance people use when they're unsure how much of themselves they're ready to reveal. But in every small gesture, in every glance, something had begun to soften, like a melody slowly finding its rhythm after a stretch of dissonance. One evening, as Claire and Lily prepared to leave Magnolia House, Ethan stood at the porch to see them off. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of wet grass after a late afternoon rain. Claire turned to thank him for that day's lesson. Ethan smiled, then asked unexpectedly, "Have you ever wondered if sometimes we come across an old melody again? Not by chance, but because it's waiting to be finished." Claire froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. But as she took Lily's hand and walked down the worn stone path beneath the dusky sky, her heart gave a quiet tug. Maybe no meeting is truly accidental, especially when it awakens something inside us that we thought had fallen silent forever. On a gray afternoon, as soft rain fell over the moss-covered rooftops of Magnolia House, Claire arrived earlier than usual with Lily by her side. She had been asked to clean the attic, a rarely visited space, thick with dust and memories filled with relics from a time when the house was still a grand private estate nearly a century ago. Ethan was not there that day. His absence felt unusual. Claire had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, but she didn't ask. His not being there gave her a rare space to be alone with her daughter. They climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The old wooden door creaked long and low as it opened, causing Lily to instinctively draw closer. Claire switched on the flashlight on her phone and gently led her daughter in. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and damp paper, a faint chill slipping through dust-covered windows. But Lily wasn't afraid. On the contrary, she seemed enchanted by the ancient trunks, the time-worn violin cases, and the leather-bound books resting on crooked shelves. While Claire swept cobwebs from a far corner, Lily wandered quietly among the boxes. Then came her soft voice. "Mommy, what's this?" Claire turned and saw her daughter holding a bundle of old sheet music tied together with a fraying silver ribbon. Claire came over and carefully undid the knot. Inside were pages of handwritten music, delicate pen strokes, clean and precise, but without a title. On the very first page in the upper left corner, a single line in black ink read, "Foresee." Claire froze. She flipped quickly through the pages, her heart pounding. The notes, she knew them. It was the same nameless melody she had once played on the old piano with Ethan, note for note unchanged. She had always wondered how she had known it so clearly. And now the original sat in her hands. Written by someone's hand, the ink faded in places, but still carrying the weight of emotion. Lily whispered, "Mommy, my name starts with C too." Claire didn't answer. She was drifting, drawn back towards something long forgotten. Something once faint, but now coming into focus. She stared at the words, "For C." Could that C for Claire? Or was it someone else entirely? And if it was her, who had written this music, and why it had been hidden here among the dust and silence of the attic? She remembered Ethan's face the first time he heard her play the melody, the way he had held something back, something difficult to say. Claire slipped the bundle gently into her bag. She told Lily they would ask the manager about returning it if it belonged to someone. But deep inside, suspicion stirred one she could no longer brush aside. She and Ethan had met as strangers, or so it seemed. But if this was the house where he had once lived, once composed, then perhaps their meeting wasn't chance at all. Perhaps they had met before in a life she had forgotten or a chapter she had buried. Claire left the attic with heavy steps. Lily chattered beside her, excited about the old instruments and leather books. But Claire remained silent. She said nothing on the walk home. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Claire unwrapped the sheet music again. She played it slowly, piece by piece, and for the first time the melody didn't feel distant. Each note guided her like hands leading her through a door she hadn't known was still open. She saw a summer long ago, a young man with bright, sorrowful eyes, a promise never kept, and a love that had never been named. Claire rested her hand gently over the words, "For C," and closed her eyes. Inside her, the question rang out clear and sharp. Who is Ethan Whitaker? And why is this music here, written for someone with a name that begins with C, just like hers? The answer was out there somewhere, perhaps hidden in the past, perhaps waiting to be revealed on a future afternoon. But Claire knew that after today, she could no longer pretend not to wonder. Because some melodies are never written by accident, and some secrets can't stay sleeping in the attic forever. Claire couldn't sleep. After Lily had drifted into slumber, she sat alone at the old upright piano in the corner of their modest apartment on Perry Street. The sheet music lay before her like a secret freshly unearthed, its faded ink bearing the quiet weight of time. Again and again, her fingers traced the melody marked with the words, "For C." Her hands ached from repetition, but what unsettled her wasn't fatigue, it was the feeling. A strange, disorienting sense that she was walking back into a chapter of her life she had either tried to forget or had never been allowed to fully remember. And at the center of that buried story was a name she could no longer ignore: Ethan Whitaker. The next morning, after dropping Lily off at school, Claire returned to Magnolia House alone. It wasn't her shift. She wasn't expected. But she couldn't wait another day. She needed answers. She needed to know where the music had come from, why it echoed so precisely with a melody she had once carried like a ghost in her memory. And above all, she needed to know who the man was, the man her daughter was beginning to trust, and the man she herself had begun to open her guarded heart to. As Claire stepped into the grand hall, she spotted Ethan near the window at the far end of the corridor reading something on a tablet. He looked up at the sound of her steps, surprised to see her. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the bundle of sheet music from her bag and laid it on the nearest table. "You wrote this, didn't you?" Ethan looked down at the pages, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, I did." Claire folded her arms tightly, trying to steady her voice. "Then the next question is, why was it tucked away in the attic? And what does 'for C' mean, Claire? Me or someone else I just happened to share an initial with?" Ethan exhaled softly, as if this moment had lived in his mind for years, waiting for him to be ready, and he still wasn't. He gestured toward a chair, offering her a seat, but Claire refused. She stood, her eyes alight with anger and confusion, and something deeper still, pain. Ethan rested his hands on the edge of the table, his voice lower now. "I wrote that song almost 20 years ago. I was just 20. I was at a summer music camp in the northern countryside. That's where I met her. She was studying vocal performance. Her voice was pure and sad, so much like yours the first time I heard you sing. We only had a few weeks together, but I loved her." Claire didn't blink. Her voice was a whisper tight with something old and aching. "What was her name?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Charlotte. Her name was Charlotte." Claire went cold. He didn't know. He couldn't know. She had never told him. Never told anyone at Magnolia House. Claire was the name she had chosen later, a name to begin again with after the most devastating change in her life. Her birth name, the one on old documents on her child's birth certificate, was Charlotte. She spoke barely audible. "I'm Charlotte." Ethan stepped back, stunned. Claire looked straight at him, her shoulders trembling. 9 years ago, I left that camp with a child growing inside me, and I never heard from you. Not a letter, not a call, nothing. I thought you chose to leave us behind." Ethan's face collapsed in disbelief. He sank into the chair, bowed forward, as if the weight of the truth had finally landed on him after all these years. "I didn't know. Claire, I swear to you, I never knew. After that summer, my family sent me to study abroad in Europe. Everything changed overnight. They controlled my mail, my phone. I sent letters, dozens. I swear I did. No one ever answered." Claire sat down heavily across from him, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had carried so many years of silence and resentment, so many nights of wondering if he had simply turned his back. But the look in his eyes now, the sound of his voice, this was not the face of a man who had walked away. Ethan moved closer, kneeling before her, fumbling with his wallet. He pulled out a weathered scrap of paper and unfolded it with care. It was the original draft of the melody, scribbled lines in youthful handwriting. At the bottom, a single note: "For C, I'll find you again, I promise." Claire broke. Her sobs came quietly, not from weakness, but from something deeper, the soft collapse of a burden, finally too heavy to hold. She didn't know if she was weeping for the years she had spent alone, or for the truth that he had once searched for her just as she had waited without ever admitting it. But she knew one thing now. Without question, Lily, the child he had never known, was the thread that connected the man he was then with the woman she had become now. She reached out, brushing her hand against his cheek. "I thought you left me behind." Ethan looked up, his own eyes red with unshed grief. "And I lived every day carrying the weight of that broken promise. But if you'll let me, I want to begin again." Claire didn't speak, but her hand stayed in his, gentle, steady, and for the first time in 9 years it did not tremble. After that confrontation, Claire left Magnolia House without saying another word. She walked slowly down the stone path, now blanketed in golden leaves, her hands clenched tightly around the straps of her bag, as if letting go would shatter the fragile thing she was trying to hold together. Inside her was a storm, quiet but relentless. Ethan hadn't known. He may not have abandoned her on purpose. He may have truly searched, truly waited, may have tried to keep a promise that life never allowed him to fulfill. But pain does not vanish with a single explanation. 9 years. Too much had passed, Claire had lived in the shadow of abandonment, raising a child alone, surviving countless sleepless nights without a hand to hold. Those were years no one could return to her. And though a part of her heart wanted to believe Ethan, she wasn't sure she had the strength to forgive. That evening, when Lily ran to her bubbling with stories about her day at school, Claire smiled as she always did. She brushed her daughter's hair gently, paid dinner, bathed her, read her a story. Every gesture followed the rhythm of habit, but within her there was a quiet unraveling. After Lily had fallen asleep, Claire sat by the window looking down at the quiet street below. Light rain had begun to fall. She held the sheet music marked for C in her hands, turning the pages over and over again, as if somewhere between the lines she might find the answer her heart couldn't yet voice. In her mind, she saw Ethan as he had been the day before, kneeling, trembling, his eyes carrying a lifetime of regret. She couldn't deny his sincerity. But forgiveness wasn't a door that opened so easily, and forgetting that was even harder. The next morning, Ethan didn't show up at Magnolia House. Claire wasn't surprised. She knew he would give her space, but it was that very absence that left her hollow. Every echo of her footsteps in the corridor made her pause, waiting for a familiar shadow. She hated herself for that, hated the part of her that hoped. She didn't want to miss him, didn't want to feel this softness. But her heart, stubborn and quiet, did not obey her mind. By late afternoon, Claire made a decision. She called the house manager and asked to take leave from her position at Magnolia House. She gave a simple reason: she needed time with her family. But in truth, it was an act of retreat. She believed that if she severed the ties, no more piano, no more quiet afternoons with Lily in that sunlit room, no more crossing paths with Ethan on the stairwell, she could return to some kind of balance. What she forgot was that some sounds don't need to be repeated to echo forever. That night, as she sat by Lily's bed, her daughter looked up at her suddenly and asked, "Mommy, why doesn't Mr. Ethan teach me piano anymore?" Claire didn't know what to say. Lily's eyes were wide, puzzled, a little hurt. "I liked learning with him," she said softly. "He never yelled like my school teacher. He said I should play with my heart, not just the notes." Claire lowered her gaze and pulled Lily close. She didn't tell her the truth that Ethan was her father. She wasn't ready for that. But she also couldn't bring herself to deny what Ethan had begun to mean in Lily's life. When her daughter fell asleep, Claire stayed in the dark, staring into nothing. She thought of Ethan again, thought of his face when she told him the truth. There had been no panic, no denial, only pain and something else, grief. She thought of herself, of the 9 years she had stood strong alone, and she realized something she hadn't known how to admit until now: she didn't want to forgive. Not yet. Maybe one day when the wound had settled into a scar, but she didn't want to hate him either, because hatred would trap her in the past, and if she locked the door too tightly, Lily would never have a chance to know what it meant to have a father. Claire rose from the edge of the bed, picked up the sheet music, and gently placed it in a drawer. She didn't know what she would do next, but for the first time, she wasn't running from the truth. She didn't forgive, but she no longer carried rage. She was learning to stand in the space between those two places. That, too, was a beginning that would take time, and a quiet kind of courage. 3 weeks after Claire left Magnolia House, a cream-colored card arrived in her mailbox. The paper held a faint vanilla scent, and printed across its center in deep brown ink was a single line: "You are invited to a performance at Magnolia House Saturday, 6 o'clock in the evening. A night for songs that were never finished." No signature, no further details. But Claire knew. She knew the moment her eyes met the words, because only one person had ever spoken to her about unfinished music, as if it were a vital part of who he was. She hesitated for 2 full days. The invitation lay on the dining table beneath a vase of dried lavender. Each time she passed, she glanced at it, and each time Lily asked, "What's that, Mom?" Claire only smiled and changed the subject. But on Saturday evening, moved by something she couldn't name, memory maybe, or the quiet ache of music that still lived in her chest, Claire decided to go. She chose a pale blue dress, soft and simple like smoke, then took Lily's hand, and together they stepped into the starlit night of Savannah. Magnolia House shimmered beneath golden lights strung through the branches of the old oak trees. The great wooden doors were open. From within, the gentle notes of a piano drifted out like breath. There were no formal rows of seats, no grand stage, just a simple arc of chairs gathered around the old grand piano in the heart of the parlor, the very room where Claire had once sung a nameless melody for a man she believed was a stranger, but who turned out to be someone who had once moved her heart more deeply than anyone else. The man who had left her. The man who had carried a melody for 9 years. Claire stepped into the room and stopped short. Ethan was seated at the piano, no suit, no tie, just a white shirt and black trousers. The light caught his face in a way that softened every edge, made him look not like a man hiding behind years of silence, but like one who had finally come forward stripped of pretense. No more hiding, no more running. Lily gripped her mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, he's right there." Claire gave a small nod. She didn't speak. She only led her daughter to a seat in the front row. When Ethan saw them, his eyes paused for a moment, but instead of surprise or nervousness, he smiled, slow, warm, steady. Then he turned to the piano and placed his hands on the keys. The music began like a whisper. No introduction, no dramatic opening, only a quiet stream of notes flowing gently like water moving through darkness. The room stilled. Claire stilled. Even Lily sat quietly, her eyes wide. The melody wasn't for C. It wasn't a love song, not in the way one might expect. It was fragments of memory sewn together with sound. It was the echo of footsteps long lost trying to find their way home. It was the softness of a father who had never held his daughter as a newborn. It was the ache of a man who had loved in silence, who had waited without knowing he was waiting. It was an apology that words could never carry. As the piece swelled, Claire instinctively lifted her hand to her chest. Something tightened inside her, something old and wordless. Tears welled in her eyes before she realized they had fallen. She looked at Lily, who was listening intently, gently fingering the edge of her worn necklace. The music faded and Ethan lifted his hands from the keys. He stood, walked to the single microphone placed in the center of the room, and spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "This piece has no title. It's a song I wrote for the girl I once loved, the woman I never forgot. And for an 8-year-old girl who taught me that sometimes what matters most doesn't need time, it just needs courage." The room held its breath. Claire, wiping tears from her eyes, leaned down and whispered the truth she had kept hidden for so long into her daughter's ear. Lily's eyes widened, shifting from her mother to the man at the piano. Then Lily stood. She walked toward him slowly, her small shoes quiet on the wood floor. She looked up at Ethan. "You're my dad, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan dropped to his knees, his eyes full. "Yes," he said. "If you'll let me be." Lily nodded once, then ran into his arm. Applause rose from around the room, but Claire heard none of it. She could only hear the sound of her own heart thudding, fragile, overwhelmed. She stood and walked toward them. Ethan turned and their eyes met. He didn't speak. He simply held out his hand. Claire stepped forward. She placed her hand in his, her eyes still filled with tears, but lit now with something softer, like hope, the first signs of healing. And in that moment she understood. Ethan's final composition had never been a farewell. It was always an overture. A beginning for something that had never truly had a chance to begin. Until now. Lily sat curled in Ethan's lap, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around his neck, as if afraid he might vanish again. Around them, the last remaining guests at Magnolia House had begun to drift away, as their footsteps soft against the old wooden floors. But Claire stood still, just a few steps away, her hand gripping the edge of an old handkerchief tucked deep in her coat pocket. She didn't know what to say, unsure if she was ready to face what had just unfolded. But then Lily turned and looked at her eyes so clear and wide, they seemed to see right through the tangle of confusion knotted inside her mother's chest. "Mommy, you're not sad, are you? I just wanted to hug Daddy." The words came out like a breeze, gentle and barely there, but enough to shatter something fragile inside Claire. She shook her head and stepped closer. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sad. You have every right to hug your father." She sat beside them, her hand brushing softly against Lily's back, a quiet gesture of reassurance. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes unable to hide the wave of emotion behind them. He whispered thank you so low that only Claire could hear it. She didn't answer, only nodded slowly. A moment later, Lily slid down from Ethan's lap and wandered over to the piano, her small fingers playing the simple melody she had been practicing lately. Claire stayed seated on the long bench, Ethan sitting beside her. They said nothing for a long while, the room filled only with the halting notes of a child learning to make music, each key pressed like the tentative steps of someone just learning how to walk. "I didn't expect her to accept me so easily," Ethan said at last, his voice hoarse with restraint. "She's like you, Claire," replied her voice soft as mist. "She loves with her whole heart, and she doesn't hold anything back." Ethan nodded, then turned to her, and for the first time in years let the vulnerability in his gaze show without trying to hide it. "I don't deserve that. Not from her. Not from you." Claire turned to meet his eyes, her own calm but deep. I used to be so angry with you, Ethan. Angry that you disappeared. Angry that I had to hold everything together for all those years. But tonight, watching Lily, I realized she doesn't need a perfect father. She just needs someone who truly wants to be here. Do you, Ethan? Do you truly want that? He didn't hesitate. I do. I've missed too much already. If you'll let me, I want to start again. Claire said nothing for a long time. Inside her memory and present tangled in a quiet storm, old wounds brushing up against a fragile new hope. Then Lily came back, wrapping her arms around both of their legs. You two look cute sitting together like that. Claire laughed. The sound was light, a little shaky, as if even she was surprised it had survived somewhere inside her. Ethan looked at her, the glimmer of hope unhidden in his eyes. You don't have to answer now, I understand, he said. Just give me the chance to be here. Not once, but every day, to be our daughter's father. Claire reached out and smoothed Lily's hair, her hand tender. I'm not making any promises tonight, Ethan, but if Lily chooses you, I won't stand in her way. We'll let her lead the way, one step at a time. Lily looked up, her face as bright as a spring morning. Then can you come for breakfast tomorrow? Mommy makes the best pancakes. Ethan laughed. If Mommy says yes. Claire smiled, looking first at Lily, then at Ethan. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. That night, as they left Magnolia House together, the three of them walked beneath the glow of the yellow porch lights that still shimmered softly beneath the eaves. No one said another word, but something had been set in place between them. A choice had been made. Lily had chosen her father. And Claire, for the first time in many years, was no longer afraid to let her heart open just a little more. The next morning, Ethan arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, just as Claire had asked. He wore a simple button-down shirt, leaving behind the stiff suit jackets that had once defined him. In his hand was a small bouquet, not of expensive blooms, but of wild daisies, wrapped in newspaper, as humble and unassuming as the uncertainty he carried in his chest. Claire opened the door in her plain sleepwear, her hair still tousled from sleep, but her eyes did not look away. Lily was already at the breakfast table, beaming, fork in hand, waiting. Mommy made pancakes with peanut butter today, Daddy. They're so good. She squealed when she saw Ethan step in without the slightest hint of awkwardness or reserve. Ethan took a seat and accepted the plate Claire handed him, his heart sinking with a quiet, unfamiliar ache. This warmth, the sound of voices echoing in the small kitchen, the scent of coffee drifting through the air, it was all so familiar yet so startlingly new, like a dream he never dared to believe he could live. After breakfast, Claire stood by the sink washing dishes while Ethan helped Lily finish her drawing assignment. When Claire returned, she found the two of them giggling over a cat Lily had colored bright green, and something inside her, something long sealed, began to slowly open. But feelings alone did not erase the past. Once Lily had gone out to play in the yard with the neighborhood kids, Claire sat across from Ethan in the living room. Her voice steady, her words without hesitation. I need to know something. Why did you leave back then without a word? Ethan looked at her for a long time, as if searching for the most honest way to shape an old wound into something she could hold. Claire, I was a coward. I was afraid. Not of you, but of myself. When my mother died, I fell apart completely. I had nothing left, no money, no future. When I found out you were pregnant, I thought I'd only drag you down. I convinced myself that leaving would hurt less for both of us. Claire clenched her hands in her lap, her eyes locked on his. But you didn't understand, did you? It's the silence that hurts the most. I know, Ethan said, his voice low. I've lived with that guilt every single day for more than 8 years. I watched you from a distance. I saw you raise our daughter on your own. I wanted to come back so many times, but I couldn't bring myself to. Then that night, hearing you sing that song at Magnolia House, everything inside me collapsed. Claire didn't respond right away. She turned to the window where Lily was skipping beneath the sunlight. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow but sure. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive the years you missed, but I don't want to live chained to resentment either. What I can offer you is a second chance, not for the past, but for now, for Lily. Ethan fell silent, then gently reached for her hand. One chance is enough. I won't waste it. Claire nodded softly, not pulling her hand away. For the first time in what felt like forever, what stood between them was no longer the stories that had already been written, but something slowly being built. She didn't call it love yet. She wasn't ready to name it forgiveness, but in the way they looked at each other that morning, they both knew. Some songs need to be rewritten from the beginning, and this time they wouldn't leave the ending unfinished. Magnolia House was still the same old estate nestled in the heart of Savannah, but under the early summer light it seemed to wear a new soul. The ivory-painted wooden frames, the moss-covered steps, and the morning birdsong all remained, yet something had shifted. No longer a vacant property held in limbo by a distant corporation, Magnolia House had become the beating heart of a quiet rebirth. Claire stood at the gate holding Lily's hand with Ethan beside her, no longer just a father newly reunited with his child, but a man learning to mend what had once been broken. They stepped inside as if walking into their past, but this time not to repeat old mistakes, rather to write a new chapter. Ethan had officially signed over the rights to Magnolia House for a new community project. It would no longer gather dust as a forgotten asset or serve as a hiding place for memory. Instead, it would become a music center for children and single mothers, a space where buried dreams could rise again through each piano key, each lifted voice. Claire had been invited to serve as the center's executive director. She accepted after a few days of reflection, not for the title, but because she knew how many mothers had once stood where she had, alone struggling through days with no one to lean on, clinging to music like a small flame burning quietly inside. Ethan didn't take on a managerial role, but he was there every day. Sometimes he taught a small piano class to a group of spirited children. Sometimes he repaired crooked piano legs or watered the backyard garden. Claire would often catch him standing still, staring at the grand piano in the hall, his eyes distant, as though listening to melodies only he could hear. The bond between them grew slowly, unhurried and quiet. Some days it was as simple as sharing a cup of coffee after work. Other days, they took Lily to the little bookstore on the corner, and there were nights when they sat side by side in the music room, not speaking, letting the silence blend with the distant strains of a rehearsal in progress down the hall. Lily adapted quickly to her new world. She became a little member of the center, happy to share her books, her snacks, even her homework with the other children. She wasn't as skilled at the piano as her father, nor could she sing as beautifully as her mother, but she held a pure love for sound, and that alone made Claire's heart swell every time she saw Lily place her hands on the keys. One afternoon, while dusting off the old bookshelf in the Magnolia House library, Claire found a linen-bound music journal in soft blue. Inside were incomplete melodies handwritten in a script she recognized instantly. It was Ethan's handwriting. She brought it to him. Ethan opened the book and paused for a moment before saying, "I wrote these when I didn't know where you and Lily were. It was the only way I knew how to keep the memory alive." Claire traced a faded line of notes, some blurred with time and ink. Her voice was barely more than breath. "Do you think we could finish it?" He smiled. "Not just me anymore. The three of us." Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast a golden slant across the wooden floor where Lily sat reading her hair, tousled eyes focused. Claire leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. In that old house, a new beginning was quietly taking shape. Not perfect, but real, warm, full enough of hope to make them stay. Magnolia House was no longer a place to run from. It had become a place to belong. The autumn rain came on a late afternoon when the maple leaves had just begun to turn and the sun no longer seemed eager to linger in the sky. Magnolia House wore its damp coat quietly, its glass panes misted over with droplets, the path lined with bricks now slick and glistening under a veil of dew. Claire stood beneath the porch roof, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of ginger tea, watching the rain fall in a steady rhythm beyond the eaves. The air carried the scent of wet earth, of fallen leaves, and the tender stillness that only autumn could bring. Ethan approached with a light jacket draped over his arm, gently slipping it around her shoulders. Claire said nothing, only offered a small smile, her gaze still following the beads of rain collecting along the wooden railing. In the distance, Lily was playing in the rain, with a few children from the music class, her hands clutching an overturned green umbrella like a little boat catching puddles, her laughter rising like an impromptu symphony of joy. Claire spoke, her voice quiet and reflective. "Do you think we can truly rewrite the music of our lives this time together?" Ethan stood in silence for a long while. Rain had dampened his hair strands clinging to his forehead as he reached up to brush them aside, then turned to look at her. "Not rewrite, Claire. Continue. We can't erase what's come before, but we can choose how to tell the rest of the story." She nodded, her eyes drifting to his hand resting on the railing. A hand once calloused, once hardened by both physical and unseen pain, now trembling slightly, whether from the cold or something deeper she could not name. "I used to fear I'd loved the wrong man," she said, "that I'd placed my trust in someone who would never return. I used to believe I'd never be able to forgive you, but then I saw you with Lily, and I realized some loves don't die. They're just buried beneath pain. You weren't there when I needed you most, but you came back when I no longer believed anyone would." Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "I used to live inside my own punishment," he said. "I believed I wasn't worthy of love, of fatherhood, of living a life I could be proud of. But then you and Lily, the two of you pulled me from a darkness I had dug for myself." Claire turned to him, her eyes no longer heavy with blame, but filled with a deep, quiet understanding. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Old memories, old wounds, they did not fade simply because hope had returned. But if they could walk it together, then even the cold rain of autumn or the golden sun of spring could become beautiful memories. "I don't want a promise of forever," Claire said softly. "I only want you to promise that today, just today, you will stay. You will choose me, choose Lily, and choose yourself." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "Today, I promise. And if tomorrow comes and you still want to hear it, I'll promise again." They stood together beneath the porch of Magnolia House, rain falling in long silver ribbons, before them cold but not lonely. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart settling into a quiet rhythm, not rushed but full of trust. In that moment she knew the music they were composing together would never be flawless, but it would be real, and it would be enough. Like the rain falling on a chilled autumn afternoon, sharp and soft all at once. Every Saturday morning, the small concert room inside Magnolia House opened its doors to welcome children for free music lessons. The old piano keys were polished with care, and sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm ribbons of light across the wooden floor. Ethan was always the first to arrive. He laid out sheet music, adjusted the benches, and placed a pencil beside each score. When Lily walked in, she brought with her a kind of quiet energy, both shy and eager. It had been more than a month since Claire had placed her hand in his beneath the autumn rain, and just as many mornings since Lily had begun calling him Dad, with an ease that no longer needed prompting. Today's lesson was special. Ethan wasn't just teaching Lily about notes or rhythm, he was teaching her how to feel. Sitting beside her, his hands guided hers over each key, each pause, as if he were passing on something that couldn't be written, couldn't be named. Claire watched from a distance, her hand at times pressed gently against her chest, trying to steady the emotions rising inside. In the soft light of the room, she saw clearly the man who had once vanished from her life, now quietly teaching their daughter to play her very first song. A song shared only between father and child. A song called Morning Light. It was Lily who had chosen the name one early morning when the three of them sat at the breakfast table by the window, watching the sun rise. Claire remembered how Ethan had smiled gently, then leaned in and asked, "If you could name this warm feeling, what would you call it?" And Lily, without hesitation, had whispered those three words. The little recital took place that weekend. Just family, a few close friends, and the other children from the class. But for Ethan and Claire, it felt like a grand ceremony. Claire dressed Lily in a white dress with a silk bow tied at the back, her shoes carefully polished to a quiet shine. Ethan wore a dark suit, simple yet elegant, his eyes bright with a kind of quiet wonder, as though he were stepping onto a stage not just for the first time in years, but as a different man. When father and daughter entered the room, hushed into stillness. Lily climbed onto the bench, her small feet still not reaching the floor, but her eyes were focused, full of trust. Ethan sat beside her, giving a small nod. They began. The first notes rose slowly, a little uncertain, like the first steps of a child just learning to walk. But then, beat by beat, their connection found rhythm. Ethan guided not just with his hands, but with his heart. Claire sat in the front row, her eyes brimming, for her music had never been just sound. It had been memory, pain, lost love, and now the fragile hope of something rediscovered. She saw Ethan not just as Lily's father, not just as the man who had once broken her heart. He was a teacher now, a partner, a quiet presence walking beside her in the unwritten symphony of her life. When the final notes faded into silence, no one clapped right away. The room remained still, as if afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile moment holding them all. Then slowly, applause rose from somewhere in the back, growing into laughter, cheers, and the quiet shedding of tears. Lily turned to Ethan, her eyes shining. "I did it, didn't I, Daddy?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as though letting go might wake him from a dream. Claire stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Their eyes met. No words were needed. In that look, a new chapter had been written. One where the father, the teacher, the once lost love had finally found the music within himself again. And in the harmony of the three of them, there was no room for regret. Only love, only beginnings. The garden at Magnolia House shone brighter than usual on that April morning. Gentle sunlight filtered through the branches, falling over the flower beds in a patchwork of blooming color. White ribbons swayed between the magnolia limbs, drifting softly in the breeze like low-hanging clouds suspended just above the earth. Simple wooden chairs had been arranged neatly along a path strewn with petals. There was no red carpet, no grand spectacle of a lavish wedding, but every detail had been lovingly placed, each moment prepared with care. This was not a ceremony made for display. It was a sacred beginning. Ethan stood beneath an arch woven with white and pale violet flowers, dressed in a quiet gray suit, yet his eyes gleamed brighter than ever. Beside him stood Lily, wearing a princess dress Claire had sewn herself. Her hair tied with a pink ribbon, her eyes wide and sparkling with excitement, she made no attempt to hide. Claire emerged from the far end of the garden, her hand resting gently on the arm of an old friend, the librarian from the place where she once worked. Her gown was classic, the bodice softly embracing her slender frame, the skirt light and flowing like white clouds. No tiara, just a simple crown of flowers in her hair. And in that gentle simplicity she looked as though she belonged to the garden itself, as if she had always been part of this place. As she approached, Ethan's gaze followed her, as if caught in a spell. His breath faltered, and something in his chest stirred, as though the music he once thought had ended was beginning again. Claire smiled a smile, quiet and full, carrying with it more than words could hold. They didn't recite vows from a book. Instead, they spoke to each other from the heart. Ethan spoke of the long years he had lived like an unfinished melody, without rhythm, without anyone to listen. He spoke of Claire as the first sound to break the silence in his soul, and of Lily as an ending he never imagined, but one that had turned out to be everything. Claire told the story of a girl who once believed love was a luxury, that trust had died alongside the moments she had been left behind. But Ethan had returned, not in the glow of wealth or triumph, but in quiet presence beside a piano, where every emotion she had buried slowly found its way back to life. When they exchanged rings, the air itself seemed to pause. The trees whispered in the breeze, birds sang above, as if nature had composed its own score to mark the moment. Lily, with trembling hands, brought the rings to her parents, then wrapped her arms around them as applause broke into the air. After the ceremony, everyone gathered at a long table beneath the trees for a simple meal. There was warm apple pie from neighbor Ruth's family recipe, a salad made from the community garden Ethan and Lily had tended together, and glasses of red wine catching the late sun like rubies. Claire rose with a microphone in hand, her gaze turning to the children seated at the far end of the table. "Today," she said, "instead of a speech, I'd like to hear a piece of music." Then she turned to Ethan and whispered, "Are you ready?" Ethan nodded. He walked to the piano placed in the center of the garden, the very one Claire once said she wanted to hear sing on her special day. What he played was a new version of Morning Light this time, with added harmonies written for Claire's voice, and a little accompaniment for Lily, who joined in with the tiny harmonica she carried everywhere. As the music filled the garden, the world grew still. Not for technical brilliance, but for the honesty it carried. The song held a journey inside it, the journey of a love once lost, a family once fractured, a house once used for hiding that had become the place where everything began. When the final note fell quiet, Claire stepped to his side, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Ethan smiled, and for the first time in years he no longer felt like the man who had written pain into the story. He felt like the one writing a new chapter with his whole heart. Magnolia House from that day on would no longer be a place of forgotten songs. It would be the place where love once believed to be lost was found again, whole and true. One early summer afternoon, as sunlight slanted gently through the trees and the cicadas hummed softly from a corner of the garden, Lily sat quietly in the small music room at the back of Magnolia House. In front of her lay a blank notebook, its pages still carrying the scent of something new. On the table was a sharpened pencil lovingly prepared by her father, and the piano stood just ahead, silent, as if waiting patiently for something yet to be born. Claire passed by and paused at the half-open door. Her daughter was so focused, so absorbed, she didn't even notice someone was there. Claire didn't call out, didn't step in. She simply watched quietly, her heart full, held still by the moment. Since the family recital, something had shifted in Lily. She was no longer just the little girl who tapped playfully at the keys, but a small soul growing into the kind of depth that only comes from feeling more than she could yet name. Ethan always said that music didn't need to be perfect, only honest. And Claire could see their daughter beginning to understand that truth in her own quiet way. A few days later, Lily handed her mother a folded sheet of paper, her handwriting neat but tiny, printed carefully on the outside, for Mom and Dad. Claire opened it. Inside was a simple composition, just a few lines of melody and a title written in soft purple ink. Mom and Dad. She couldn't speak. She stared at the notes, some clumsy in rhythm, a few not quite placed right, but there was something breathtakingly pure in every measure. When she asked when Lily had written it, the girl smiled, her eyes bright as morning. I listen to you and Dad talk at night. I hear him playing piano when you fall asleep on the couch. I wanted to write down how that feels, because I'm afraid I'll forget it one day. Claire pulled her close heart swelling to the point of breaking. An 8-year-old child might not fully grasp the weight of loss, but she could feel the tenderness of healing with astonishing clarity. When Ethan saw the piece, he said nothing. He simply held his daughter and gently placed the composition on the piano's music stand. We'll play it at the end of term recital if that's what you want. Lily hesitated, then nodded. The recital took place on a Friday afternoon. The main hall of Magnolia House was filled with parents and relatives, the air buzzing with quiet pride and anticipation. Claire sat in the front row, not as the organizer this time, but simply as a mother full of wonder. Ethan waited behind the curtain ready to accompany if needed, but Lily stepped out alone. She held her notebook close to her chest, her face a little anxious, but her eyes steady and clear. She walked to the piano, opened the book, and took a long, slow breath before placing her hands on the keys. The melody began hesitant at first, each note like the careful steps of someone just learning to trust the ground beneath them. Yet every sound held the weight and warmth of a journey, not just Lily's, but the journey of Claire and Ethan too, of long days spent in loneliness, of the quiet yearning for forgiveness, of the improbable beauty of finding their way back. When the final note faded, applause erupted through the room. But Claire just sat there, hands clasped over her chest, tears falling freely before she could stop them. Her daughter had written her very first piece of music. Not to impress, not to prove herself, but to preserve something sacred, the feeling of being loved, of being safe beside the people she trusted. After the performance, Ethan stepped on stage, lifted Lily high into the air, and spun her around in a circle of laughter and joy. Claire watched them, her heart full of gratitude. She knew that this first piece wouldn't be the last, and from now on in this house that once held silence and sorrow, music would continue to echo. Not from pain, but from love restored. As summer gently yielded to the golden hush of autumn, everything around Magnolia House seemed to slow. The wind grew still in the afternoons, the sun dipped behind the treetops a little earlier each day, and the wooden chairs in the music room still held the faint warmth of students who had just left. Ethan often came here once the house had grown quiet. He would sit alone at the grand piano in the center of the hall, beneath the soft amber glow of an old lamp casting its light across the worn wood. No sheet music in front of him, no audience in sight, just him and the familiar keys. At first, Claire thought he was simply unwinding, letting the day fall away through music. But after a few weeks, she began to notice these melodies didn't repeat. They weren't aimless or rehearsed. Something was taking shape. A piece, a composition, a song with no title. One night, long after Lily had fallen asleep, and only the sound of wind brushing past the shutters filled the rooms, Claire came downstairs with a blanket in hand, ready to cover Ethan like she had so many times before. But as she paused at the bottom step, she stopped. He was playing, his eyes half closed, fingers moving with a delicate reverence as if touching memory itself. The melody he played was not sorrowful nor entirely joyful. It held something in between, something warm but fragile, as if every note had been drawn from the quiet spaces where words had failed. Claire didn't interrupt. She sat in the shadows listening, once, then again, and again until it became habit. Each night that Ethan played, she was there even if he never knew. Until one evening, as the music reached what felt like its final lines, Claire stepped out of the dark. "I used to think you'd call it forgiveness," she said softly. "Or maybe home. Or something like that." Ethan smiled, letting the last chord drift into silence. He turned toward her, his voice low and light. "You know," he said, "every time I try to name it, it changes. It refuses to stay in one feeling. Sometimes it's the morning I saw you again. Sometimes it's the way Lily looked at me when she realized I was her dad. Some nights it's the sound of you sighing in your sleep. Other nights it's your footsteps pacing the living room when you're worried." Claire sat beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. "Then, what is it?" she whispered. Ethan paused, then answered, "It's me. It's how I love you, without needing to call it anything." Claire squeezed his hand. "I don't know if any piece of music can hold love forever." Ethan lowered his head, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It doesn't have to," he said. "We just have to play it again every day." That night, for the first time, they played the piece together. A quiet duet between two people who had once been strangers to each other's pain, now bound by something deeper than explanation. Upstairs, Lily cracked open her door and watched from the hallway, her young face lit with the tender joy of a child who knows she's safe, who understands just enough to treasure it. The next day, Ethan placed the composition on the stand and signed it with a simple mark, 3 empty notes. No title, no prelude, no ending. He told Claire that some things are meant to be nameless, because naming them might limit what they're truly meant to be. Over time, the piece became something of a signature in Magnolia House. The children heard it often, sometimes played by Ethan, sometimes sung softly by Claire, sometimes accented by Lily and her tiny harmonica. With each performance, the melody changed just slightly, taking on new colors, summoning different feelings like a story that refused to end. It was never published, never performed on any stage, yet it traveled quietly through the hearts of everyone who passed through those wooden doors. Some called it an unspoken love song. Others said it was a hymn of healing. But to Claire and Ethan, it had no name at all, and it didn't need one, because they knew with quiet certainty that sacred things are not made by what we call them. They are made by how they make us feel. And in that old house in the heart of Savannah, the unnamed song still played each day, like the gentle breath of a love that had endured, a love that kept writing itself again and again in the space between silence and sound. One quiet morning, while Magnolia House was still wrapped in mist and the flowers had yet to open their eyes, Ethan sat alone in the study. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper and an old fountain pen, its metal worn to a soft bronze from time and use. He had carried this thought with him for weeks, ever since the nameless melody was finally complete. It wasn't something he needed to do to begin again, but something he knew he had to do to close the past with grace. He wrote the first line slowly, as if each stroke of ink echoed a heartbeat once lost. To Charlotte, the girl from that summer. I don't know if you still remember ever being called by that name. It was simple, unassuming, but to me it was an entire chapter of youth. You were the girl standing in the middle of the summer recital hall, your hair tousled by the wind, holding sheet music in trembling hands, singing as if your heart had found the words the world had forgotten. You never knew that somewhere in the back of the room a boy sat quietly, afraid to come close, afraid to speak his name. He simply held on to the melody you sang as if it were a treasure meant only for him. I was that boy, and I loved you from the very first day. A love too young, too wide-eyed, and perhaps never brave enough to become anything more than a quiet ache. But that love brought me to music. It made me write. It made me hope that someday, somewhere you'd hear a piece I composed and somehow know it came from me. I wrote my first song for you at 17. It was never finished, just like I was never whole enough to be worthy of entering your world. I left that summer camp without goodbye, without a trace, carrying the unfinished song in the heart of a boy who had no courage. Years later, you became Claire, a strong, quiet mother, raising her child with every ounce of herself. And I remained Ethan, a man dressed in the shell of success, but hollowed out inside, running from what I couldn't face. I missed too much. I wasn't there in the years I should have been. But fate, however delayed, found its way back. And I know that if I don't write this letter, the part of my memory named Charlotte will always remain a silent note never released. Charlotte, if a part of you still lives within Claire, then please forgive the Ethan of before. Forgive the cowardice, the disappearances, the hurt I didn't yet know how to hold. Let the man I am today close those chapters not with shame, but with the honesty of someone who has traveled far, wandered lost, but found his way home. I don't ask you to keep this letter as a keepsake. I only ask that you look back on the girl named Charlotte with gratitude. Because it was you, your eyes, your voice that planted something miraculous in me, the courage to love, and to no longer fear being loved in return. Ethan folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with red wax. He didn't mail it. He simply placed it in the drawer of his desk alongside old sheet music and forgotten melodies. Claire would never read it. But one evening, while tidying Lily's study nook, Claire found a handwritten copy of the letter tucked between the pages of a small music notebook. On the first page was a simple dedication for Mom from Dad who never forgot Charlotte. She read it in silence, her eyes resting on each word as if listening to a song Ethan had once been too afraid to sing aloud. She closed the letter and smiled, not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been embraced. And in Claire's heart, Charlotte was no longer the girl left behind. She was the girl who had been loved in the quietest, purest way imaginable. Autumn in Savannah carried with it a quiet sweetness, a kind of softness that settled over the city like a breath held gently between seasons. Gone was the brilliant glare of summer, and not yet had the sharp stillness of winter arrived. The trees lining the main avenue had begun to shed their leaves, turning slowly into a tender watercolor of gold amber and warm, earthy browns. Inside the softly lit room of Magnolia House, Claire sat hunched over the final version of a plan she had dreamed of for years. A community concert open to single mothers and children who had never had the chance to chase their artistic dreams. It was something she had carried in her heart for so long, from the time she was a young girl herself. Standing in a run-down music classroom on the outskirts of the city, watching children's faces light up with joy just from touching the keys of an old piano. Claire had never let that dream go. Even when life asked her to pause it for work, for motherhood, for the unspoken weight of heartbreak, she had kept it burning inside her like a flicker of morning light. And now, because of Ethan, because of Lily, because of Magnolia House, that dream was beginning to take shape, one careful step at a time. Ethan entered quietly while Claire was still deep in her notes, 2 cups of steaming tea in hand. He placed one beside her, said nothing, and sat down, eyes scanning the seat map, the list of names, the lineup of performances, each one marked in Lily's soft, rounded handwriting. Claire turned to him, and her eyes in that moment held a gratitude too vast for words. "I used to think maybe I'd never be strong enough to do this," she said softly. Ethan reached for her hand, his voice steady and warm. "Some dreams only need one thing," he said, "for you to never let them go. Sooner or later, they'll find the ones who are meant to walk them with you." That evening, they hung paper lanterns in the garden together. Lily worked carefully in the grand hall, pinning handwritten invitations to the message board with delicate fingers and quiet concentration. Each card was not just an invitation, but a small plea from the heart: come, sit down and listen with everything you are. On the night of the concert, Magnolia House was fuller than it had ever been. Mothers arrived with children in tow, some wearing worn coats, but eyes alight with anticipation. Children stared wide-eyed at the grand piano they had only seen in pictures, their hands twitching with nervous energy, wonder, and longing. Claire stood behind the stage curtain, watching as the chairs filled one by one. Her heart beat slowly, but with a quiet strength. Ethan stepped beside her, leaned in, and whispered, "You did it." Claire squeezed his hand tightly. But she didn't cry, not yet, because she knew the most beautiful part was still to come. As the lights began to dim, the first notes of the evening did not come from the grand piano at center stage, but from a circle of small wooden instruments held carefully in the hands of the children from Claire's volunteer music class. The melody was simple, steady, and quiet, but it carried a silent strength that stirred memory like a gentle wind rustling leaves in autumn. Here and there came soft, scattered laughter, the sound of someone breathing through emotion, slow and grateful applause spreading through the room like ripples on still water. When the final note faded, Claire stepped into the light. She carried no script, no high-powered microphone. Her voice filled the space with nothing more than warmth and truth. "I was once a single mother," she began. "I used to think music was a luxury, something meant for people who had time or means. But music saved me. It brought me back to myself. It brought me back to a man who once let me slip away, and it brought me here tonight to all of you." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, stopping on the faces of women who, like her, once had sat in quiet corners with hearts full of silence and unspoken dreams. "If there is one thing I hope you carry with you after tonight, it's this. Your dream is still there. Even if you are tired, even if you've been hurt, even if you've folded it away and tucked it into the deepest corner of your heart. Believe in it. Hold on to it, because one day you will sing it aloud, in your own voice." No one spoke. But when Claire lowered her head in a quiet bow, the entire room rose in a standing ovation, long, deep, and resonant like rain falling after a long and aching drought. Claire lifted her gaze, and through the crowd her eyes found Ethan and Lily standing at the back of the hall. She smiled, not for the success of the concert, but for the truth that her dream had finally been sung fully and fearlessly through the woman she had become. There was nothing left to regret, no reason to look back. Only the path ahead remained, and she would walk it step by step with music in her heart and the unwavering faith that the most beautiful moments were still waiting just beyond the horizon. One late autumn evening in the softly lit room where warm light washed over the familiar surface of the piano, Ethan placed a new piece of music in front of Claire. The page still carried the scent of fresh ink, but there was no title, only a single handwritten line tilted gently in the upper left corner, second verse. Claire looked at him, her eyes asking the question her lips didn't need to form. Ethan simply nodded. This wasn't an ending. This was the next verse. A new chapter in the life they had chosen to write together, no longer burdened by regret or unfinished words, but filled with hope, healing, and dreams still waiting to unfold. He began to play. The first notes floated gently into the room, soft and familiar, like the breeze threading its way through the leaves of the Magnolia garden each early morning. Claire sat beside him and began to sing. It wasn't a song built on complexity or grandeur. It was a song of truth. The voice of a woman who had once been left behind, who had raised a child on her own, and who now sang not for anyone else, but for her own life. Lily sat quietly on the doorstep, clutching her first music notebook, her eyes shining as she watched her parents play a song written just for them. She was beginning to understand something precious, that music doesn't always need words, but when words do come, they carry a piece of the soul that wrote them. Second verse was not a rewrite. It was a continuation. A melody picked up where the last left off, bridging the unfinished with faith, forgiveness, and a love that asked for nothing in return. Claire and Ethan's story was never a fairy tale. It had broken once, even shattered and hurt in ways too deep to name. But what made it beautiful was their choice to come back, to face the past, to forgive the damage, and to bravely write what remained of their story, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. Love in the end isn't about staying when everything is perfect. It's about finding each other in the flaws, in the quiet, uncertain places where it seems there is no way back. Life is the same. We lose our way. We fall. But if we can hold on to even a single thread of belief, there is always a melody left to write, a verse that waits to be lived differently. Dear friend, if you've stayed with us to the very end of this story, I'd like to ask you something. What did this story stir in you? Did it remind you of someone who once passed through your life? Did it awaken a dream? You set aside a chance you never quite took, or a word you never said aloud? If it did, we'd love for you to share it in the comments below. We're here to listen, not just with ears, but with the heart. And if this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing to Emotional Echoes. Share this video with someone you care about, because maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one to pass along the light someone else is quietly waiting for. We'll return soon with more stories like this, full of emotion, humanity, and quiet inspiration. Thank you for being here, for listening with your whole soul. Until next time, we wish you strength, joy, peace, and a life that feels whole day by day. Goodbye for now, and may we meet again in the next melody life has yet to play.